Welcome to Chatter. I'm David Priess. This week, historian and author Chris Kempshall on politics and national security in the Star Wars universe.
You know, I own all of the Expanded Universe books. I've read all of the Expanded Universe books. I really enjoy the Expanded Universe books. The Expanded Universe was a mess. You know, the New Republic was always 15 minutes away from being overthrown by some neo-imperial goblin before, you know, the Holy Trinity of Han, Leia and Luke jumped in the Millennium Falcon and went off to save the day. You never actually get a vision that this thing that everybody is fighting and dying for is worth it, that it actually works. There's a what-if Star Wars comic where Vader survives and comes back to the light side and appears in this white armour to be like, let's go hunt down my master. And I like to imagine everybody else go in the background going, or you could go to jail for all the horrible, horrible things you've done.
Chris Kempshall, welcome to Chatter.
Thank you very much for having me. I've been looking forward to this for ages.
I've been looking forward to this for almost as long as I've been alive. And that's personally awkward because you weren't alive at that point. But I was looking forward to
a whole 21 years.
To an opportunity like this because there are two things from a very young age that I was obsessed with. I have many interests, but two of the most dominant interests I've had for decades and decades are the Star Wars universe, because I grew up at a time when the original movies were coming out. And I have the toys to prove it, as our listeners can't hear, but I can show you on screen.
It is Boba Fett.
It's so sad. His right arm, since, you know, the early 1980s, has just kind of wobbled because it was overused from some child. And so he can't really hold up a gun anymore. And he has to be more resourceful when he's in action figure form.
Yeah. But he's a resourceful
so
guy.
Star Wars is my is one. And then the other, of course, is politics, history, national security. That's what I ended up making a career out of instead of Star Wars. But we are going to talk at length about the overlap of those two things, which is absolutely wonderful. Let's begin with your background. What was your academic work, and how did you get to a place where you ended up being a renowned historian of the First World War and teaching at Sandhurst, things like that?
So it's an interesting one because I never actually wanted to be a historian. Most of my when I was doing my own degree, college equivalent in America studies, was I wanted to be like a soccer commentator. I wanted to be a sports journalist. And then I slowly at one point had the dawning realization that nobody actually needs that many soccer commentators and sports
it's a small
journalists. Pool. So the obvious, alternative to being faced with the difficulty of a career where there aren't many opportunities and there aren't many jobs was obviously for me to pick academia, where, it's so much better for that type of thing. So I kind of fell into doing history, and then my PhD was on relationships between British and French soldiers during the First World War. That's what I spent 5 years doing, and I did the PhD, and then I was quite tired when I finished in 2013, and I got this opportunity I then started kind of segueing weirdly sideways through kind of elements that kind of cross purpose or kind of cross-pollinate with history, but are basically more kind of representations of my own geeky interests. So I started doing some work on the representation of kind of history and the First World War in computer games, which I found. I'm
going to actually pause you there because I have not read that work, but I am very, I'm very curious indeed. What games do represent the First World War in any depth? Because obviously there are many conflicts that delve into others, but the First World War does not get as much attention in my experience. Please tell me where I'm wrong. So
what's interesting is that, firstly, you're not wrong, but you're not wrong in some really interesting ways. So, I imagine for you and probably for a lot of the listeners, when they think World War and computer games, they think Second World War, because there was a big period of time during the 1990s, shortly after Saving Private Ryan came out, which kind of rejuvenated the Second World War media industry. We get loads and loads of computer games that just basically redo the opening of Saving Private Ryan, and then you'll go and do Enemy at the Gates and be a Soviet sniper in Stalingrad. And it's all of these kind of cinematic moments in games. What's interesting is, out of the First and the Second World War, the first computer game in kind of the 1980s to focus on either of the world wars was on the First World War. It was a flight simulator game with biplanes and the like. Then the Second World War kind of massively swallows up the field during the 1990s and the like. But in the lead up to the First World War centenary in 2014, you started to see this emerging wave of new computer games focused on the First World War, because Second World War computer games had kind of fallen out of fashion a little bit. And you get like the equivalent of there was an online first-person shooter game called Verdun, which, says it does exactly what it says on the tin. It's, it's online, you either play as the French or the Germans, and you fight over no man's land up down the Western Front. And then you got like a big AAA, which is like, the Hollywood equivalent of a computer game called Battlefield 1, which was a similar first-person shooter. But you also got some really interesting story games, some puzzle games, some resource management games appeared. There's a game that I absolutely adore called Valiant Hearts, which is a kind of a point-and-click adventure game of various characters set around the Western Front. It's absolutely beautiful. It's a deeply moving game, which I found, fantastic and super interesting. And then I thought, well, First World War centenary is going to end in 2018. Who's going to care after this? I'm going to have to, find myself, something proper to do. And people are still making First World War computer games. There's like a game came out this year called The Last Train Home, where you're controlling members of the Czech Legion as they try and get home during the Civil War through Russia. So they take the Trans-Siberian Railway. There's a game called War Hospital. It's amazing. And if you'd have told me in 2013, you know what people will be playing in 2024? It's a game with a train and Czech soldiers and the Russians. Yeah. Like, well, that's just nonsense, isn't it? That's never ever going to happen.
Community, and we've done conversations here about it. It is absolutely amazing that you can have people who rally around an otherwise obscure historical fact. So one battle in the 14th century that didn't get, it's not a top 10 battle of that century. No. You will find gamers get around it, use it as an opportunity to learn more about history, but also with a good game design, it's inherently interesting regardless of the specific incident.
Yes. I'm a strong believer that these types of games, and I've got some, I've done some kind of written academic work on it, are a really interesting gateway for a section of the audience to find out more about history. A lot of people get hung up about, is it accurate? Is it authentic? And to an extent, I don't really care about that type of thing, because it's not trying to necessarily... Basically, if historians outsource their work to computer game developers, then we have to live with what we get. But if it's a starting point and people then dig deeper and they start reading books or watching documentaries, then how can this possibly be a bad thing? I was
fascinated. We spoke with Volko Runke, who designs historical board games. And one he mentioned to me that I had not heard of that I found just amazing was a game designed around the Pacific Ocean and the Polynesians, and the fact that over thousands of years, they did, in some cases by chance, in many cases by mastery of ocean currents and navigation, they discovered islands thousands of miles apart, in some cases very isolated. And the game, you're basically doing that. You're going into this unknown ocean and then using very limited means to go out hundreds of miles and explore islands. And I'm like, what a great concept.
That sounds great.
Never would have thought of that.
Yeah, that sounds super great.
Here you are, you're emotionally ruined from the absence of a broadcast career, but you found a way to find some really interesting academic work at the intersection, particularly of gaming and history. But there's this big Star Wars universe out there too. When did you get involved just as a person of interest in Star Wars? And then how did that merge into your writing and research?
So, I've always been a Star Wars fan. We had recorded off of the TV on old VHS. We had the original Star Wars and Return of the Jedi. We didn't have The Empire Strikes Back, which is a little odd. as a result, I don't remember when I found out that Darth Vader was Luke Skywalker's father. I don't have a moment of that when I didn't know that I can recall. So I really, really kind of, I always enjoyed the films and the computer games and the like. And then, I don't know, maybe kind of 1995, 96, 97 or something like that. I was in America and I went into a bookstore in Florida and saw a Star Wars novel. I was like, I like Star Wars, I like novels, I'm going to buy this and read this. And it was from that point which I then started kind of mass consuming the books and games and everything. So I'd always had that kind of burning away in the background was, at least, I don't know, 2/5 of my personality were somewhat interested in Star Wars at any given day of the week. And then when the computer game stuff did like surprisingly well, like improbably well, through a really kind of weird mishmash of circumstances, the kind of history commissioning editor at Taylor and Francis or kind of Routledge in the UK said, you did this book about computer games and you did this article about computer games. Maybe we should think about doing a book. Have you got any ideas about stuff you'd like to do? And I was like, I've got loads of ideas, but what are we talking about here? Are we talking like proper history ideas or geeky nonsense that I really want to write? And he was like, whatever you want. So, well, I want to write a book about Star Wars. I want to write a book about history and its portrayal and its relationship with Star Wars, because I think it's really interesting. And I'm prepared to either believe that other people find it really interesting or force it upon them until they accept that it's
right
interesting. By attrition or by popular consent, I will have my book. And from there, that's kind of where it started spiraling from. That he said, I think this sounds good. Have a contract. I missed most of my deadlines because of Disney kept moving the release date of the sequel trilogy back. And then there was a large pandemic, which rather disrupted writing and life. But yeah, it was the fact that having succeeded in a geeky historical thing seemed to give me credence that I could do other similar things. And I got into a point in my career when basically I was... My criteria for do I want to do a thing is will it make me happy? And I thought this would make me happy. So I decided to do it.
That truly is career success, right? It's not having an additional title after your name or going up a certain ladder somewhere if it doesn't bring you joy. It's, is this fun and can I somehow support myself on it? And you found a way.
Because, if I'm going to spend a lot of what turns out to be a lot of years researching and reading this book, and the only thing that's guaranteed at the end of it is I have a book, I might as well be pleased and enjoy that book and enjoy that process. Because otherwise, why would you do it to yourself? God, there's so many other things you could do instead.
The funny thing about all this, and it's true for me, even though I have not written books on this, but I've thought a lot about this universe. You, of course, in the researching and writing, had to think a lot more. You can't just pull from memory. You have to check references and make sure when things were mentioned or not mentioned, and how much of that is my interpretation and how's my logic and argumentation and evidence for those judgments. But that means that you, and to a lesser degree me, and to a lesser degree thousands or millions of people, have given much more thought to these issues than George Lucas did when he wrote the original screenplay.
Yes.
He clearly had thought some things out. Interviews show that. His biography shows that. But he had not thought things out at the level of the obsessives like we are trying to figure it out. Which leads to frustration with the universe not being necessarily internally consistent at times, or even being plausible at times. And yet it's understandable, because he wasn't trying to set up the world's most popular franchise to be absolutely perfect in all respects. He was trying to make a fun movie.
Yes. And the only criteria of, will I do this, will I not do this, was if George Lucas convinces George Lucas. Because he is master of the entire universe. It doesn't, he can change the rules whenever he wants, and did. So he doesn't care about that kind of internal consistency in the same way that the rest of us do, because we're trying to figure out, I'd really love to see this in a thing, but it doesn't quite fit with this thing. So how would I find out how to bridge those two things? And George Lucas would just, it works because I say it works. That's the only measure of what he's doing. And the other thing that's kind of important to acknowledge about George Lucas is that whilst George Lucas, is inspired by history and is inspired by politics, and he has these kind of conceptions of them, they're very kind of pop culture or popular history conceptions of history. But George Lucas isn't a historian and isn't pretending to be one. So to expect him to create a beautifully, perfectly crafted, entirely logical piece of history is to massively and unfairly misunderstand what it is that he's trying to do. It's exactly what I was saying to you earlier, actually, that if historians outsource the making of history to computer game developers, then we have to live with what we get. And similarly, if we're going to expect George Lucas to do our job for us, then we're going to have to live with whatever George Lucas comes up with. We can't then criticize him for not making it in the way that we would have wanted him to.
Well, let's dig deeper into that a little bit. I remember I had an English literature teacher, just an English teacher in probably middle school, Donald Kuglich. I remember him for that. And I remember him primarily for this line that he said, which for some reason stuck with me when so much else of that era didn't. But he said, and I'm sure it wasn't his original, but it came to me through him, literature is always a reflection of the time in which it is written. You write a historical novel, guess what? It's actually revealing more about what you think about what's happening now. And that's obvious with George Lucas in Star Wars. He clearly had real world events and themes in mind when he was writing about the Empire and the underdog rebels and all of this. Like you said, it may have been a pop history understanding at best. It may have been amateurish in some ways that are revealing. But talk through that. What were George Lucas's influences, and especially in the original trilogy and then the prequel movies? What were the main historical themes that he was consciously and perhaps subconsciously pulling on?
So when George Lucas sits down, or well, even before George Lucas starts writing and working on Star Wars, he's working on Apocalypse Now, which is, stuck in development hell, because that's the story of Apocalypse Now. It's always, they might still be making it now, such is the development hell attached to Apocalypse Now. So he's already working on a Vietnam War film. And the Vietnam War is the thing that exists in George Lucas's world. And he, at various points, kind of, when he was growing up or when he was getting ready for college, this kind of underlying fear that he was going to have to go to Vietnam. And after a while, when any one of the many, many periods when it looks like Apocalypse Now isn't going to be made, he breaks away from it and sits down and starts, and this is effectively a quote, writing a Vietnam War film in space. And the first drafts of the Star Wars, as it was known, explicitly reference Vietnam and kind of the Viet Cong and the like. So this is the lens through which George is viewing his world at the moment. Even though by 1977, Vietnam War's done. But despite this, it's still this big overarching moment and fear that exists in his life. And that's the story that he's aiming to tell in the original trilogy. He gets a little annoyed at times in a way that, in my mind, the imagination I have of it is, and God bless you, George, I find it quite funny. The idea that he stood in the back watching people watching Star Wars, and then they're all strolling out afterwards going, what a great science fiction pew pew laser film with swords and bad guys. And he's there going, what about the subtext? Why aren't you understanding it's about Vietnam? And he's a little annoyed consistently that people don't get it, this is what he's trying to say, that in his conception of it, the Galactic Empire is America fallen into fascism. And the Rebel Alliance is the Viet Cong. They're fighting a asymmetrical jungle guerrilla war out of temples against a massive, technologically advanced enemy with the power to destroy entire planets. I mean, you can say many things about George Lucas. Subtle isn't one of them. It is clearly there if you choose to see it. And the other kind of big figure that dominates George Lucas's kind of mindset and view of the world is his arch villain, which is Richard Nixon. And who amongst us has not checked under the bed before going to sleep at night, to be entirely sure that Richard Nixon is not lurking under the.
Now, it's funny though, because the whole idea, as we'll get into, the whole idea of the Empire, it is so amorphous and generic. In that first movie. The villain is Darth Vader. For all intents and purposes, of course, you see Tarkin and you see other people in uniform who talk like any other parody, if you will, of military officers. But the villain is Darth Vader. And I got to say, I'm willing to give George Lucas a lot of leeway, but Darth Vader does not look like Richard Nixon.
No, not at all. You really, ordinarily, if you were to be charitable, maybe I can squint a little bit, but it's just not there. And eventually when he makes Return of the Jedi and he says, okay, Emperor Palpatine is Richard Nixon, which, again, I reckon if Richard Nixon could shoot lightning out of his hands, Watergate would have turned out very differently.
I think new historical research is showing that Nixon did shoot lightning out of his hands, but I don't expect you to be a Nixon expert as well. But Darth Vader to me, maybe this was in the myth Star Wars big movement that came about maybe a couple of decades ago, and there's a huge, I think of it, the Smithsonian here in Washington. There was a huge exhibition on it that ended up traveling. The Darth Vader imagery, borrowed from some Japanese, which makes sense with Lucas and Kurosawa's influence. But as a villain, Vader didn't seem like much of a proxy for America. The whole theme was, the whole idea may have been, but I can understand audiences walking out and not seeing it as a Vietnam allegory, because Vader dominated the screen in so many interesting ways and was not in any way reminiscent of what people thought about America. No.
And what then becomes interesting is that, like, particularly those in the cast and the crew view Darth Vader as they refer to him as being like Darth Hitler. They make him a Hitler proxy. And I struggle with that as well, because, it's not like Hitler didn't have quite a clear ideology in what it was that he was trying to do. And Darth Vader doesn't exude any of that. Darth Vader kind of exudes villainy. But there's nothing particularly behind it that you can say, okay, this is what Darth Vader believes in. Because so much of that ideology behind the Galactic Empire is kind of just implied in that they're the bad guys without necessarily being dug any further. Which again, is absolutely fine. It ties in quite well if you consider it, as how George Lucas constructs and conceives sort of evilness. You don't have to explain what they want. You just have to dress them in the uniforms and people will get it. But Darth Vader becomes very difficult to pin down in a historical kind of comparative sense, because he isn't really anything.
I think that's an interesting point that speaks to so much about the expanded films and the rest of it too, which is there's a lot of, I'll probably pronounce this wrong, but I can see the word clearly in my mind. There's a lot of ahistoricity. There's a lot of ahistorical things going on with mishmashing of uniforms, borrowing elements from the First World War and the Second World War, and also some, SWAT teams and police forces. But I think that's also true with Vader in a way that speaks to the larger point, which is, okay, that wasn't Lucas's point. He wasn't trying to do a historically accurate film. He was talking about symbols, and Vader is a symbol that's more important than the particular digital design on his chest or how he was placed within the military command structure.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a quote from, I think somebody who ended up working on Return of the Jedi, that they were in a cinema on opening night for the original Star Wars in 1977. Nobody knows anything about this film. It's not like today where you can log onto the internet and get behind the scenes and trailers and synopsis and anything like that. So everybody's basically going in cold, except, it's a space film and people are excited. And he reports that when Darth Vader walked onto the screen for the first time, people in the audience booed, because you got everything you needed to know about Darth Vader just by how he looked. You didn't need any more explanation that this is a bad guy, and probably, you know, one of the most bad guys that you're gonna see in the film. I find that fascinating that was all that you needed to transmit through the screen directly to the audience to provoke them to boo.
Makes me want to ask you, I heard recently that there is maybe movement is too strong a word, but there is a group of people who believe that one of the best ways to watch the original Star Wars is black and white if possible, but certainly silent. That the cinematography, the imagery, along the lines of what you mentioned with Vader, but also the way that they put Obi-Wan on screen and how they use him on screen, that it actually is a very compelling watch with no sound. I'm wondering what you think about that.
I mean, I would be very willing to watch that. I mean, there's an element of it. It feels like you're cheating the control in that I don't need to watch the sound of Star Wars. I already know all the lines in my head. So in that sense, I'm definitely not losing anything from the experience. But what I would is that I imagine it would make you actually just watch it. You know, there's a difference between, you know, sitting down and I'm going to put a Star Wars film on and I'm going to watch this and actually look at what's happening on the screen, as if I haven't watched it a million times previously.
Right. And I can understand doing that on purpose with some parts of the prequel trilogy and the sequels to avoid some of the awkward dialogue. But in the original movie, I think it would be interesting just as a way to get more from the experience.
Yeah, I could definitely see the interest and fun in doing that.
We're talking about the first movie here, but we will expand to other things. But even within the first movie, you have the stormtroopers, right? And
yes,
the very idea of the stormtroopers is a very Nazi thing. That does not read as a clear analogy to an American thing.
No.
And if both in the movie itself, but I think it's written more clearly in the novel that came out for the original Star Wars movie. The stormtroopers are, of course, renowned to have crazy accuracy, right?
Yes.
Only stormtroopers could do this.
But they will never actually do it.
What you see is, and part of it's just because of the budget of the film, occasionally you'll see the stormtrooper coming, stepping over the threshold and tripping and I think part of that is the illusion that we have from other movies that, shooting any weapon at range is precise and accurate when it usually is very much not. So we have a false sense of what should be precision. But the stormtroopers have a very different reputation than what we actually see when they're in combat. What's your take on that?
It's an interesting example where, like, large parts of that kind of understanding and background of them are almost outsourced to the audience rather than ever actually displayed on screen. Because, in 1977, people have been watching Second World War films. They understand what a stormtrooper is. Even though, again, I'm trying to think of it's a reasonable way into the first film before anybody even uses the word stormtrooper. And stormtroopers as a word is incredibly rare in the trilogy. But it's that sense of, in the same way that people can look at Darth Vader and boo, you can look at them and go, okay, those are evil henchmen soldiers. They're wearing this kind of weird body armor stuff. The uniformity of it plays into a broader cultural understanding of what it means when you see a bunch of guys in Nazi uniforms run on screen in a Second World War film. It's the uniformity fills in the gaps for the audience. So, they bring their own understanding to it. So the film doesn't even have to explain that to them. You just kind of get it.
All right. Let's move forward into the substance a little more. And I should note for the record that we're not just having this conversation out of the blue. You have two different books from two different publishers in recent years. One is The History and Politics of Star Wars, which I think we're going to talk about a lot of the themes in there. And that's an analysis, right? That is you applying.
Yeah, that's my kind of
your
academic history book,
right? And it brings on themes. It illuminates things about our world from Star Wars and about Star Wars from our world, which is probably the subject of much of our conversation. But you also have a very new book from a different publisher, DK, in the Star Wars universe, and that is a history, the rise and fall of the Galactic Empire. Presumably written by an historian who is
Yes.
after the events of the ninth movie in the Skywalker saga. And that also fills in some gaps, but really pulls together loose threads from a bunch of different areas within the Star Wars universe. So you've done your homework. I want to play Stump the Chump and just ask you a bunch of questions about different aspects of the lore that's behind this. But of course, some of that lore has changed. Some of it has evolved quite dramatically as things have gone on. And so I'll start with that meta question is, if you look at the original trilogy, which is really the core, right? It is the Coruscant of the Star Wars extended universe. There are some unifying themes there, but there is, out of necessity, a major gap here and a major gap here and a lot of unexplained things here, most of which don't create problems in the trilogy itself.
No.
Some awkward stuff with Luke and Leia, right, going on at the beginning, but that's retconnable.
Everyone chooses to forget that by Return of the Jedi.
It's awkward at best. So looking at the original trilogy first, extending beyond the first movie through all of them, obviously Lucas had a bigger arc in mind, very loose arc, but as a unit, those three movies work for most people really, really well, to the point that some people said, certainly, don't do all 9, but even the prequels offended quite a few fans because they felt that the package was solid. Obviously, you have accepted the entire extended universe, including the TV shows, the games, many of the books that are still considered canon. But how do you interpret that debate, if you will, about the original trilogy versus the now, corporate monstrosity that is turning out Star Wars things every week, it seems?
Yeah. I mean, on almost kind of like a base human level, if people just want to have the original trilogy and that's their Star Wars, then yeah, sure, why not? Help yourselves. And, there are a lot of people, say that the next Star Wars film comes out and people will go and watch it, and their only interaction with Star Wars has been watching Star Wars films, even if it's like
right.
one of the 9 and the 2 extra ones, and they haven't read every book, they haven't read every comic, they haven't played every game, and so there are degrees of interaction with Star Wars, and in that sense, wherever people choose to draw the line, they can absolutely draw the line. I am a geek and a historian, and I like to take the whole thing. And I thought that when I was getting ready to write history and politics, I'm not the first person to invent this wheel, that, there might be a link between historical material and Star Wars. But a lot of those studies that existed in kind of academic forms or kind of popular forms really only looked at the films, which I've always found incredibly understandable, because it's not too difficult to sit down and watch a bunch of films and then have your thoughts, and you can I'll look at some George Lucas interviews and the like, and you center everything around George Lucas, and therefore it becomes a lot more manageable. But Star Wars doesn't stop. Star Wars it has a brief pause from 1983 until about 1990, when you don't get a huge amount more. But then from 1990 onwards, with what used to be called the Expanded Universe and is now Legends, you get dozens and dozens and dozens of books, and dozens of comics, and dozens of games, and dozens of toys, and it becomes a mass thing. And all of that is Star Wars too. It interacts to a variety of ways, of kind of both works well and works difficultly with the original trilogy. But my thought process was, well, if you're going to do a thing about how Star Wars as a franchise interacts with this, then you can't just limit yourself to the films, because actually the films are probably the minority of actual content, of stuff that you could put on a screen is dwarfed by the amount of stuff that you could look at on the page. But the underlying issue was it isn't reasonable to tell a historian, okay, if you want to do this, you need to read 1 billion books and play 1,000 computer games, unless that historian had already wasted their life doing that.
There's the catch, right?
There's the catch. So, it's not. I don't think it's accurate to say I'm the only person who could have written this, but it was going to need someone like me, who had already done all of this stuff and already owned all of the books and already owned all of the games and the like, to then sit and go, actually, if we want to have a cohesive understanding, we need to have a cohesive set of material, and that means we're going to have to spread this net as wide as is possible. Because only through kind of weight of material can you actually begin to see patterns emerging and interesting stuff. So in that sense, my aim was, firstly, okay, we'll take everything, or with the limits of human endurance. But also, there's a as you'll have read in the book, there's a significant part, certainly in the introduction, that is an explanation of the major plot lines in a bunch of book series and the like, because the hope and the aim is that somebody else might come along and go, okay, I don't want to read 1 billion books, but maybe I only have to read these 5 books, and Chris has explained the overarching plot. And then suddenly it becomes a lot more accessible for people. So I think it needed someone to take a big swing at the lot first, to then allow everybody to carve off whatever bits they want.
That makes sense. There's also a bit of frustration from the fans who are beyond just the movie watchers, but the people who did get a little bit into the extended universe, because after the first 3 movies, there were and I'm forgetting his first name. Is it Timothy Zahn? The novels?
Timothy Zahn,
basically what happens after Return of the Jedi. And it sets up a plot which is beloved by many, that gets into Grand Admiral Thrawn and kind of the inheritors of the Empire and how it goes. But of course, the filmmakers, once it became a Disney project, the movies 7, 8, and 9 did not follow that plot line. No. And the very, very, very small Easter eggs that were there that could be connected to it don't matter if basically it wipes it clean. Obviously, that's a conscious choice. Another conscious choice was not to go with what Lucas had sketched out in detail, but instead basically pull elements of it as they saw fit, because they found themselves in control of the property. So with those choices, having a pre-existing plot line that many fans of the books really did like, and then having Lucas himself saying, this is where I see it all going, the choice to go where they went with 7, 8, and 9, how do you interpret that debate?
I've always been something of maybe an anomaly in looking at this, in that I've always found it an incredibly understandable decision. I own all of the Expanded Universe books. I've read all of the Expanded Universe books. I really enjoy the Expanded Universe books. The Expanded Universe was a mess. Just an absolute convoluted, enormous, semi-bloated thing. And it was absolutely fraught with contradictions. There's like 8 or 9 different stories about how the rebels first get the Death Star plans for A New Hope, all of which is the only story, apparently, but there's all of these other ones that exist. Han Solo and Boba Fett meet for the first time in 12 different places. So you've already got this contradicted thing, but also the Expanded Universe had been filled. To the extent that I sometimes draw a comparison to, I don't know if you all have come across them, or if your listeners, the Napoleonic War books, Sharp.
That's right.
And the trouble that Bernard Cornwell has had, where he's constantly looking for like a random weekend in 1806 where Sharp isn't doing something that he can set a new book in, because he's squeezed out all of the space and he's filled up all of the time. So if Disney had wanted to go, okay, we're going to stick with the Expanded Universe and we're going to try and make a go of this, they could have either gone, okay, let's do Timothy Zahn's Heir to the Empire trilogy of books. That is not a trilogy of books that is easily converted into a 90-minute cinematic trilogy. There's a lot going on in them, and large parts are going to get cut, and people are going to be annoyed and upset about that. Or you go, okay, we're going to leave the Expanded Universe as it is, but we're going to make our own new stories in a few of the last remaining gaps. And then you have a problem of, okay, we've set a film in this, but there's a book that comes out 2 weeks after this film trilogy ends. Why did they not mention the thing that just happened 2 weeks? It's the problem of continuity. So I always thought, well, the only way that this is going to work if Disney want to make films is they're going to have to wipe it clean and start with their own brand new empty slate. And I understand that a lot of people were very upset about that because, they were invested in the expanded universe, and I was invested in the expanded universe. But I'm looking over to the corner of my room, and my books are still there. Mm-hmm. Nobody broke into my house and burned my books. I can read them and enjoy the expanded universe whenever I wanted. Yeah. But if the choice was between not getting any more Star Wars on the screen or maintaining the very wobbly foundations of the expanded universe, it doesn't surprise me in the least that this is the decision.
And I'm not recommending this, but there is also the possibility for the true fans. You do a multiversal aspect to the Star Wars universe, and you have the alternate Star Wars universe. If this had played out differently,
and some people view it like that; they view them as two different places.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say is, having spent a bit of time around Star Wars creatives, authors, and it's you will not find a group of people more invested and more loving of the expanded universe who bring back references and Easter eggs and bits to it all the time because they love it. And again, when you see a character from the expanded universe on screen, no, they're not acting in exactly the same way that they did in the books, or they're not appearing in the same time period as they did in the books, but they're there. And the choice is you either have them in a slightly different way or you don't have them at all. And I think it's cool to see some of the things that I loved in a book in a slightly different way on a screen.
I want to talk about the Empire quite a bit, because that's kind of a thing. And when you first hear the Empire in the original movie, it is talked about in such a way as if it has been, if not eternal, that it has been an oppressive presence for generations, or so it seems. You have the oddity of Obi-Wan Kenobi,
it feels older,
right? But the timing of it is such that it's just this massive thing. And yet, here's Luke Skywalker on Tatooine, which is pretty quickly and obviously a planet that is not completely under the boot of the Imperial Army. That is, you're not seeing stormtroopers out on the moisture farms. And when you get into the cities, eventually you see them, but only because of the search teams. And yet Luke has a line in the first movie that I always found inexplicable. There's just no context for it when he says, I don't like the Empire. I hate it. And I'm like, but why? I mean, You've already established that he's not been allowed to do anything in his life other than, go do some hunting and do some flying and repair some robots. How would he have any idea what the Empire is or what it does unless there is some kind of galactic news network that is beaming things? But if so, it would be the Empire. So I have a hard time understanding the hatred of this massive, almost like Roman Empire that's been there for hundreds of years, feeling at the very beginning, and not having a mechanism by which that actually affects the trillions, quadrillions, whatever, of sentient beings in the galaxy.
I've always found that line very, very interesting, because the Empire's evilness is never actually explained to us. I mean, we see them do a very evil thing in blowing up Alderaan, which is clearly a bad thing, but that's halfway through the film. They've been positioned as the bad guys who do evil things way, way beyond that. I mean, even in the opening crawl, they're referred to as the evil Empire. So it's kind of like there's a weird circular logic to the Empire is evil. And we know what evil is because the Empire is evil, and it just kind of goes round and round and round itself, to the extent that Luke Skywalker, living not under the Empire, can go, I hate the Empire. So for what? What have they actually done to you that would make you hate them? There's also an interesting aspect that there's a book called The Empire Triumphant by Kevin J. Wetmore, I think, that asks the question, how imperial is the Galactic Empire? Because Empire in Star Wars is used clearly as a synonym for evil. Empires are evil, therefore the Empire is evil. But empires are a thing. The word empire means something. Does this empire have colonies? How imperial does this empire appear? Have they annexed parts of the galaxy? Are they running them like the East India Company? Or what does this actual imperial nature of the Empire look like? And that's never clear, really, in the original trilogy either. What makes it an empire, regardless of whether it's an evil.
I think that's fascinating right there, because you have systems like Nazi Germany that were evil at many levels and did horrific things, but were not an empire. And then you have, in our world, history of empires, the British Empire being one, that did some horrific things at different levels, but were at a very different level. And actually, it was more about the administration and governance that we use empire. And then anachronistically, we can call almost anything an empire, whether it's the Mongol Empire or the Persian Empire. Yeah. But there is definitely meaning to a term, or we would not use the term. But again, that fits into the theme of Lucas using it as a symbol. Like you said, it's evil because it's an empire, and it's an empire because it's evil. We don't really know anything about an emperor, right? The second movie gives us a flash, but even then it's really just about the symbolism of evil. It seems to me it's about control. It's about the idea of a big bad entity, collective entity, can do whatever it wants and tramples on these poor people who have the spirit of hope and pluck. And maybe that's enough, and we shouldn't, at least in the first movie, overthink the fact that the Empire was underdeveloped.
Yes, and also the fact that, George Lucas growing up in Kansas, again, saying this as somebody from Britain looking in, the idea of, the big organized man's going to come to your small town and tell you what to do, I think speaks to something within a kind of a section of American society. And you see it in George Lucas's films like American Graffiti, the kind of the idea of kind of individual small town freedom versus kind of overarching national control. I don't. In that sense, the Empire. Whilst again, we can sit here very reasonably and go, well, what even is this state supposed to be? It's established enough for George Lucas's purposes that make the film work, and we don't need to spend a lot of time thinking, an empire must mean there's an emperor. The emperor is mentioned once in A New Hope, in the sense that the emperor has dissolved the Senate. We, again, as you said, in Empire Strikes Back, we get a flash of him very briefly, and then he's a more major character in Return of the Jedi. His name is never mentioned. He's just the Emperor. His name is first mentioned in the novelization for Star Wars that came out in 76. But large parts of his name and his kind of conduct and his characterization get fleshed out kind of secondhand in the expanded universe, and then massively in the original trilogy. But nobody's leaving Return of the Jedi going, I wish I knew what the Emperor's backstory was, or what he has for breakfast, or his name, because he's clearly evil and rounded enough to work in a film.
I will agree with you to a point. That is, after A New Hope, and I was so young, I don't remember my reactions upon seeing it, but I have a vague, but I think real memory of between Empire and Return of the Jedi as a little kid talking with my friends who had the same action figures and wondering why it is that Vader was like so subservient to this shadow, and wanting to, there must be something important there, because nobody acts like that with another human being unless there's something big and bad going on in the background. And so we were curious, and that actually helped for Return of the Jedi, because then you get a lot of those questions answered. Not all of them, which I think leaves that mystery open and led to a lot of the fandom afterwards.
Yeah, no, I can completely understand that, because certainly across New Hope, and then for like the first half of Empire Strikes Back, and the second, Vader is so clearly villainous. And so clearly the bad guy, to then see him being like, oh yeah, sorry boss, I'm very sorry, I'll bow, and it's like, who is this guy? How evil must he be to make the most evil guy in apparently the galaxy be very, very careful about picking his words around him and very, very subservient to him about it, which is a really interesting kind of power dynamic that is, as you say, left completely unexplained in The Empire Strikes Back, but in a way that provokes curiosity rather than thinking, oh, there's something weird happening here. It's like, there's clearly something I don't know about this guy, which I find interesting, and I'm not dissatisfied by the fact that I don't know the answer. I'm curious that I don't know the answer. And
it's led to one of, I think, for me, one of the more interesting and disturbing elements of the universe as it's built out. And I think some of this is canon, but a lot of this is fan fiction and things. That it's not that Palpatine and Vader are sitting around, putting their fingers together, twirling their evil mustache, trying to come up with plots and giggling with glee, like acting like best friends. A lot of the backstory and the explanation outside of the movies is the absolute humiliation, torture of Vader consistently by Palpatine, basically, using his diminished physical self as a tool to just constantly push Vader, to prod him, to make him angry, to continually spur him to try to overthrow Palpatine in order to bring out the dark side forces in him, so that it's not really a partnership. It really is Vader at some level kneeling down because Palpatine has probably tortured him beyond our imagination repeatedly year after year. That's dark. It's horrible, but it does help explain some of what we see on screen without ever saying it.
You see certain elements of that in the older kind of Legends expanded universe novels. There's a thing like Palpatine purposefully designs Vader's suit so it's uncomfortable. And it pulls at his burnt skin and just because he can. And, it's an extra tool to use to torture Vader to kind of bring out the dark side emotions in him, because Palpatine is so dissatisfied with, I wanted Anakin Skywalker and what I got was you, this burnt, broken guy in a suit who's only alive because I need you to be, and you won't be alive for a minute longer than that unless you can in some way prove to me that you're worth keeping around. But I invested a lot of time and energy in you, and I've got to say I'm disappointed. And it's that kind of disappointment that fuels this torturing of him.
There is an empire, of course, beyond the Emperor and Vader. And in the original movies, there ain't much of it. It's a group of white men, older white men, usually middle-aged to older white men in very bland uniforms. And then occasionally pilots who, oddly enough, because of the poor design of the TIE fighter, are actually wearing pressurized suits in a spaceship at a time when elsewhere in the universe, people are walking around on random planets in asteroid caves without life support.
Yeah, it's all fine.
There's that. But in theory, at least, it's called an empire, and somehow they have a massive military structure that you see the tip of the iceberg. So the implication is that there is a huge, oppressive, overwhelming collective presence behind all this, which is oddly much more like, the way modern communist political systems ended up playing out in the Soviet Union, right? With the NKVD and the KGB. And so Lucas seeing, the Viet Cong as the rebel heroes, it's like, well, kind of what that leads to in governance in the communist system is the empire. But it seems to me that by not focusing on, there weren't a lot of scenes except for the council meeting on the Death Star in the first movie. There weren't a lot of scenes of how people within the empire governed or even tried to execute a military strategy. Later, there were the scenes, of course, of a few unfortunate commanders who made decisions. Vader chokes them, promotes the, here comes the next commander, like the first.
Yeah, the conveyor belt of doom.
Mostly the empire is not fleshed out. And I'm okay with that. It left people like us to ask questions and try to figure out what is the governance structure. And once we got into political science, we're wondering, what exactly is the system and what are the institutions? But there is one overwhelming presence in the first movies, and that is the allusions to Rome, because you use the word Senate. You have the empire, you have the emperor dissolving the Senate, and you have what appears to be a Caligula-like figure at the top who can do whatever he wants, and everybody's perfectly happy to execute it, no matter how ridiculous. I don't know that was deliberate on Lucas's part, or whether he was thinking the U.S. Senate instead of the Roman Senate. But the empire itself didn't need to have much more than that for the fantasy story that was being told. Later on, it did, and we'll get into how it did. But again, with the original movies, do you think that the Empire was good as a symbol in that way, or do you think it would have been a deeper experience if we would have seen even just a few short scenes of the Empire doing really bad things and how the bureaucracy enabled it elsewhere?
That's a really good question. I think firstly in regards to kind of the potential for a Rome comparison. I mean, George Lucas, when he's making the prequels, talks about Rome a fair amount. So I'm willing to believe that he's got that concept when he's doing the middle trilogy, despite the weird chronology of how he made them. And the other interesting thing about that aspect is if you expand it across or kind of map the Roman Empire onto it, one of the points of the Roman Empire was you knew who was a Roman and who wasn't, who was part of the empire and who was just a random Gaul or a Briton or something like that, which also kind of works in a Star Wars phase because we don't know what the empire is, but we know it when it arrives. We recognize the empire when we see it without necessarily having it to be explained how the empire works, which I think is an interesting Roman comparison. In regards to how it appears, whether or not we'd have needed more. I mean, one of my kind of ongoing things, and it's one of the reasons, massively jumping ahead, why I was so interested and so pleased with TV shows like Rebels and Andor, was that I wanted to see what it actually looks like, if you live on a random planet and you live in a street and you happen to live under the Empire. What is your everyday life like? But I don't necessarily know if including any of that would have made the films any better or worse. I mean, say, in A New Hope, you get Alderaan being blown up. You see the quite brutal, gruesome aftermath of Luke's aunt and uncle being murdered, which, is a weird level of horror that then doesn't really appear in any of the other films. Right. Here's some smouldering, burning skeletons. So you get a sense of an empire that will just use violence and power irrespective. And then I suppose in The Empire Strikes Back, the Empire kind of in question to how imperial is the Empire, rocks up to Cloud City and goes, yeah, we'll be keeping this, thanks. So you get that kind of sense of expansion and the Empire massively encroaching and seizing control of civilian property and the like. But because the films are so kind of top level, you're not just dealing with random rebel soldiers. You're dealing with, the key rebel leadership, and you're dealing with the key imperial leadership. That I don't know what would have happened if you'd have inserted, and then here's caretaker Dave, who also has a grievance with the Empire, but he also needs to earn a paycheck so we can pay for his space groceries. Whether or not that kind of weird dynamic would have, at the very least, had pacing issues. But what the films left me with was a desire to know more about the inner workings of this thing that had so dominated, and everybody involved with overthrowing it was so set on the fact that it was so bad it had to be overthrown. So how bad was it for your average person, trying to scratch out a living in the galaxy?
Yeah. I take your point about the scene at the moisture farm with the two mutilated bodies. And if you look carefully, it's pretty horrible. I do think that they do echo that, at least for me, when I saw the prequels and I saw Anakin on Mustafar, engulfed in flame.
Oh God,
that immediately called back for me. Oh, they're making that parallel because, that really leads to the Anakin Luke connection in a way when they're not physically present ever. But that was the connection in my mind. But
fire is the connecting bridge here.
But I got to say that, I feel like I will put a disclaimer out here, which is that, as you know, I have not watched Rebels and Clone Wars. I've avoided
that's fine.
I've avoided the non-live action. But I've seen the movies, both the Skywalker saga and the others, and then the live action TV shows. And Andor does more to show at least part of the Empire as a functioning and dysfunctional bureaucracy than everything else put together that's available in the things that I've seen. Without giving away plot points, because if you haven't seen it, it's relatively new, so some people might not have. And it is, in my mind, one of the must watches in the entire Star Wars universe.
100%.
It's a wonderful piece of fiction, and paired with Rogue One, I think that's my favorite one too, that there is out there. But the Empire is fleshed out. At least the intelligence security part of the Empire is fleshed out there. What do you think about the way that was built out, and did it create any inconsistencies for you with explaining wider parts of the universe?
I'm not sure that it did create any. I mean, I found it fascinating, and this kind of the representation of this gargantuan bureaucracy that exists. That the most evil things imaginable are happening because somebody in like an office cube has signed off on a piece of paper, and then that results in a bunch of stormtroopers going somewhere and doing something awful, or it was a really good representation to my mind of that kind of banality of evil concept, of just how boring the Empire is whilst it's doing all of these evil things. No one's having an exciting life. It's just paperwork and administration and horror, working at various points in the kind of the like a horrible flow diagram, and I found that really fascinating. Very, very bleak view of things, but what it kind of worked for me is in a level of, a significant part of Andor is this kind of burgeoning, slow-burning rebel alliance. Basically, before the rebel alliance is even an alliance, it's just kind of isolated groups who have no particular love for the Empire. But what it helped reframe for me was the extent to which this is, whilst you get like leading figures who are trying to, rally up resistance, and like how much of it is a grassroots thing of, years and years and years have gone by and things are just progressively getting slightly worse with every passing week and every passing month and every passing year, as this bureaucracy just crushes down on you. And again, in that sense, it's an extension of that George Lucas thing of the man's going to come to your small town and tell you what to do. Right. And this is 5 years after the man rocked up, and he's been telling you what to do for a while now, and it's all the things you didn't want. And there's something. Andor is kind of horrible and hopeful in almost equal measure, and I think it plays really as a really nice setup for A New Hope and Rogue One and the like, because you do see people just being crushed beneath this weight of it, but you begin to see the first kind of green shoots of people who've been pushed beyond breaking point going, I don't know what else you want from me, Empire. I don't know what else it is you want me to do or what it is you want me to give, but you've pushed me to this point where there is nothing left for me to do, and your foot is still stamping me on the face. So at some point, something's got to give. And I found that as a really interesting example of kind of the early springs of a movement that will then be embodied by Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia and the like. But at that moment in time, who cares who Princess Leia is, or who cares about Luke Skywalker when he's knocking about on a moisture farm? Because you've got Marva Andor here, and she has a message of her own that she wants to deliver, and I'm interested in hearing it.
Absolutely. Andor really made me think about something that I hadn't thought about in depth over all these years, and it involves the issue of technology in the Empire. So the kind of the conventional wisdom is that the Empire is anti-non-human at a general level. Yes. And also anti-droid, even though that's not brought out early on. You see functioning droids working on the Death Star. There's no reason to think that droids are hated until some of the later information. But general, there's this issue that there's something in the Empire and technology. And yet
there's a volume.
They're constructing the ultimate technology, the Death Star. And it is technology over even the Force and Spirit and all of this. That contrast is set up. Well, in Andor, there's an interesting angle on this, which is you have what seems to me a very inefficient system in a universe where you've established that technology is so amazing at a level that is so taken for granted, right? Functioning droids doing all kinds of things. You have anti-gravitation technology in the land speeder in the first movie that isn't even acknowledged. And yet you think about the resource challenges that must go into creating and maintaining that technology, but it is so routine as to be background for the movie. So you have a world where technology enables amazing things to be done. You can blow up planets with a laser. You can have functioning lightsabers in theory for thousands of years that have been in operation. You can have anti-gravitation technology. And yet they decide that the best way to mass produce machinery is to use prison labor, transport people across presumably light years of space in small groups to go to these prison camps instead of just setting up some robots to do the exact same manual work. And if I want to try to explain that, if I want to try to put that in universe, that the Empire hates machinery so much that they won't even allow a non-sentient robot arm like we have in factories on Earth today to do that.
Yeah, to do the robot arming.
To me, there's a real issue there that could be interesting in the universe, but to me it just seems like, no, it's because nobody wants to watch a movie about robot arms. We want to watch a person in a prison camp.
Yeah, and I think there's always going to be an element of, the demands of narrative are going to trump the logic of the situation. But I also wonder to the extent that it's a critique and a comment on the perceived technological prowess of groups like Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union, because, I don't think it'll be a shock to people. There are a subset of people in our culture and on the internet who fetishize like Nazi technology. Go, look at these fantastic tanks that they have. Look at the fantastic technology they could. Yeah, their soldiers are being dragged around by horses in carts, and that's the contradiction of the mass technological prowess of this thing versus the fact that you're still basically a horse-drawn army. I mean, you're going to lose this war because you're not that technologically advanced. And then you look at things like in the Soviet Union, going like, they put a man in orbit, and during the Second World War they made all of these fantastic tanks. Yeah, but they can't make washing machines. And which of these two things do you reckon is going to have the longer term impact? This kind of lopsided technological prowess versus technological incompetence. I wonder if that's the kind of the critique kind of level to view it at. That they're very good at making the things that they want to do and dreadful at making everything else. I
have to say I haven't thought about that until now, but there is maybe just an over-focus on the gritty worlds of the galaxy because there's a very conspicuous absence of washing machines. Let's talk about the kind of not the expansion, like the Empire Part 2. And they make a reference to this in the sequels when they're going after Starkiller Base, that this was the size of the Death Star and this was the size of the second Death Star, and now it's even bigger. It's like,
it's enormo.
You're telling the audience, we know we've had the plucky rebels going after the big round bad object that blows up planets before, and guess what? We're going to do it again because we can, and you're going to love it. So there is that. But the substitute for the Empire just comes out of nowhere. Suddenly there's this thing called the First Order that is more obviously Nazi derived. The uniforms, the attitude, the speech, everything is very, very Nazi. And yet it's supposed to be just, not a replacement for the Empire, but it's supposed to come right on the heels of the Empire and make us bring back all of the feelings we had about the Empire without explaining how one got to the other. That was a rough transition for a lot of people, even fans I know who were okay with the fact that it was going to be Rey and Finn and Poe, new characters doing new things with references to the others. They said, okay, I can buy into that. We're moving forward in the decades. But couldn't you do something a little different with, just kind of Empire Part 2 on a slightly smaller scale? How do you feel that transition went? And then among the both Star Wars adjacent community of authors and experts, as well as the wider fandom, what's your interpretation of how that was perceived and played out?
So, I mean, in the kind of the conception of the First Order, J.J. Abrams, when he was kind of working on the script and the story ideas for The Force Awakens, basically says, his idea of the First Order is, what if the leading Nazis had escaped to Argentina and decided to, get the band back together again 30 years down the road? And that's kind of a super neo-imperial, kind of neo-Nazi inspired movement. I mean, the first obvious thing to say is that it's a very different vision of the Empire than what had existed in the expanded universe and Legends, where the Empire were carried on in various forms for much, much longer in the kind of the internal Star Wars timeline, and was a recognizable entity for years and years and years afterwards. And now we've got a situation where the Empire has been gone. The war ended at a very clear, definite point very quickly after, only about an internal year after Return of the Jedi. And then you get X number of 30 years of peace, and then this Imperial thing comes back. And you kind of have to kind of reorientate to that. And I imagine, the fact that The Force Awakens is to varying extents a reproduction of A New Hope is, I think, partly fueled by a sense of kind of nostalgia, but also I think partly fueled by a sense of we need to reintroduce the audience to this, and rather than explain a new bad guy to them, we'll just put some people in some slightly different stormtrooper armor and they'll get it because they got it in 1977. So I think that aspect is kind of one of the main motivators behind it. What is interesting now is that, with the conclusion of the sequel trilogy, and, you've got a lot of kind of live action stuff now, is the extent to which that gap, that kind of unknown vacuum is now being populated by stuff. Yeah. And how interesting historically the examples or the structure of it is. Because one of the things I say in the book is that you end up with a really peculiar, and again, this is how, when we were talking about stormtroopers being a mishmash of various countries and nations and wars, and the Empire being this kind of slightly Frankenstein's monster of inspirations in the original trilogy, is that you now have a situation where the original trilogy was the First World War. Then you get the 20-year armistice between them, which is the period that they're populating now, to lead up to a feeling of appeasement to, and now the Nazis have arrived, in The Force Awakens. And a lot of the structure that you see appearing in things like The Mandalorian and Ahsoka is a very kind of League of Nations, 1920s, 1930s vibe of, yeah, fine, the Empire was not entirely destroyed and they're still over there and they're pretty angry at us and they keep kind of breaking their treaties things. But if we just leave them alone, it'll be fine, because why wouldn't it be fine? And that kind of level of historical appeasement that is leading to this cataclysmic Second World War, which I find really interesting, that it has completely reframed the original trilogy, which could perceivably have been a Second World War trilogy. And now it's the war before the war.
Absolutely. They need to give a screenwriting credit for that filling story to, E.H. Carr and Neville Chamberlain, right? You did something really interesting there. So we talked a little bit.
Well, to the extent that one of the first, just to jump in, one of the first, there's a character in the Chancellor of the New Republic at the time of The Force Awakens, when the New Republic gets blown up by Starkiller Base. His name is an anagram of Chamberlain. He's named after Neville Chamberlain. I did not know that. I'm sure I've seen the name in print, but I didn't do the mental math. Yeah, because it never comes up on screen, but the character they create is called Limber Neville or something like that. He's a Tuckerism of Neville Chamberlain. That is the extent to which they have kind of
It's kind of like that. And of course that's not Lucas, but in the prequels, Lucas did that with Newt Gunray and what was it, Lop Dodd, right? Things that seem to be references to Ronald Reagan and senator in the United States in that case. So we mentioned aliens a little bit earlier, and I do want to mention this. Some of it I think is due to the fact you're making a movie on a budget, but the first movie doesn't bring out the fact so much that the Empire is overwhelmingly with humans in power, whereas the Rebel Alliance is a ragtag force of many species from many worlds. You get Chewbacca, but he's almost eye candy. He's not a major character in his own way, even though he's a major presence. As the movies go on and the budgets get better, you do start to see it more. And then the contrast becomes more clear that, oh yeah, the Empire really is a bunch of humans and overwhelmingly male and white, but it's very much human. And the Rebel Alliance is quite diverse. With the prequels, we saw the origins of that, which is the Senate. You had all kinds of species that us geeks in the universe know the names of, and you even had the ET species in the Galactic Senate, which was a nice touch. But then you don't see that represented in the war councils of the Empire. You don't see that as much played out. The First Order is the same way. So there's definitely a theme that emerges of the fact that, maybe one of the reasons that the majority of the galaxy hates the Empire is because all of these non-human species are being oppressed. We just don't see it very often on screen. Talk about that alien dynamic and what you think that self versus other thing means, both in universe for how the Empire is able to get such cooperation, passivity in many cases from humans for what it's doing because they have a new other, and that's the non-humans. But then also what it says about us, that this is a reflection of what we should be thinking about how we treat people who don't look like us.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right in that. The underlying kind of, again, the film explanation is that costumes are expensive and humans are free. You don't have to make a human; you just have to put them in a costume, and there you go. Which even for as you say, for the Rebel Alliance, it's not until really Return of the Jedi when you actually go, oh wow, there were some not humans in this, which stands in perfect contrast. The explanation of the Empire being anti-alien never really comes up in the film. Again, it's one of those implied things that we come to understand and then gets massively fleshed out in the old expanded universe. In a way that, you kind of read, the Empire hated aliens. Go, oh yeah, no, that does make a lot of sense. It kind of enhances the thing that you see.
It's truthy, but it almost is counterintuitive because on screen you see, the slaughter of Luke's adoptive parents. You see Alderaan, which is presumably a primarily human world. Human
planet.
You don't see the Empire doing anything but mostly killing other humans. So yeah, it needs explanation later, right?
It does need explanation. And what I find interesting about particularly some of the new material, and again, there's still the tension between, costumes versus humans. I would like to see more aliens in more new Star Wars live action. I think more aliens is more good as far as I'm concerned. But I find it interesting the moments when there aren't aliens, because you can now read something into this. So again, without going into spoilers for Andor, there's as we've already mentioned, there's a prolonged sequence in an Imperial prison, and everybody in that Imperial prison is human. Then it starts making you think, and it's a pretty unpleasant prison that they're toiling away in. No one's having a great time there. So where are the alien prisoners? Are they even in an even worse place? Is the kind of implied conclusion that you should draw from this. And you end up as well with, and you get this in various parts of the animations as well, the feeling that it's taking some humans longer to understand what's going on, that I don't think anybody needed to explain to any of the aliens that the Empire didn't have their best interests at heart. I think, the vibe you're getting is that they clocked on to what was about to happen to them pretty quickly, in a way that has clear historical examples. I don't think anybody in Germany in 1934 needed it to be explained to them, if they were Jewish, that this might not pan out the way that they were hoping it to, because they recognize the circumstances of their own reality, and they can hear the rhetoric, they can see the signs are traveling down the road towards them. So in a kind of a more broader real world element, the message that kind of gets certainly conveyed to me, and I may be an outlier here, is that if there are people trying to tell you that this is going to be a bad thing for me, and you need to understand that I can recognize that this is going to be a bad thing for me, and then potentially for a lot of other people, it might be worthwhile listening to them, because they might be able to spot the signs better than I can, because, you know, they may have wandered down parts of this road before, whereas for me, this has not been my experience. And, you know, what might be just a piece of background noise to me is a big blaring siren to somebody else. And I think that's a really interesting way of viewing the Empire, that the people who were going to be early victims of the Empire recognized that pretty quickly. And then the people who were going to be the next victims of the Empire watched what happened to the first victims and gone, I think we might be next. And you then have like a very slow domino effect, eventually ending in humans going, oh God, Alderaan just got blown up. Who could have seen that coming? As that kind of realization of, actually, this isn't a great sign that's happening at the moment, and maybe we could have paid attention a little bit.
So I had the rational explanation for the human prison camp, and then I had the other thought. You know, one thought, the rationalization was, well, the way that it's set up, right? It's a very, very routine process at a certain level. Very
standardized. You need standardized workers.
You need standardized workers, and human beings come in different shapes and sizes, but only within a limited range compared to when you start encountering hundreds or thousands of alien species. So even though you have
humans have 2 arms and legs,
Greedos, Rhodians, and the Trando, you have a bunch of species that are very human-like. They're roughly human size, but they're a little bit taller, a little bit shorter, and their limbs are different enough that maybe you need humans of a certain, you know, size and shape. So that's the rationalization. The other thing I went to, though, is, well, the reason we're not seeing a lot of non-human prison camps, and not even an allusion to them, other than the Wookiees at some level, is that the Empire probably just slaughters them. Like, why would you even pay to feed them for labor?
What's in it for the state?
So it could be an even darker story, because most of the aliens we see early on, certainly in the films, almost all of them are eye candy for entertainment, like the bands that play in cantinas or sail barges. Or they're just characters to round things out, which makes me think, especially compared to the prequels, with all of the worlds seemingly represented in the Senate, that it's not just the horror that has been described in the extended universe about this slaughter here and that slaughter here. The numbers don't add up here. But there may be hundreds of worlds that have been exterminated from the non-human species.
Yeah. You know, there is a noticeable gap of background character species. And, you know, fine, you know, we spend a lot of time on Tatooine, and it's, you know, at the fringes of not quite the Empire, but kind of the Empire. So, you know, that could easily be a gathering point for people fleeing the Empire. But I didn't see a lot of aliens on Cloud City either. And that wasn't quite in the Empire, but it's not as remote as Tatooine is in that sense, or the kind of the vibe you get from it. You get like the Ugnaughts working in the conveyor belts, but everybody else walking around is also a human. Where have the background species gone? Well, you know, in comparison to the prequels, you're right. We are missing a sizable number of individuals here. So, the population numbers, you know, the galactic census doesn't add up.
Right. And unless I'm missing something, in the sequel movies, so 7, 8, and 9, you do get a more representative Rebel Alliance. That is, you see more aliens of more types than you've seen before in the scenes with the Resistance, Rebel Alliance, whatever you want to call it. And then at the Maz Kanata's bar, you see a wide range of species doing the tracking shot. Including some that were named and presumably were supposed to have roles because action figures came out. But when you look on the screen, they scroll by the guy in a third of a second. But they're aliens.
But he's got a toy.
It's good merchandising, right? Make some money. So you do have the aliens still around, but they almost seem to be in pockets, right? Like in this bar that's somehow safe on this planet, even though it's been there for a long, long time. Don't understand quite how that worked. But there's still this weird thing with aliens that I think tells a larger, deeper, darker story than they ever actually present on film. Yeah,
that, you know, they now exist in isolated spaces that are clearly safe, very clearly demarcated bubbles of security.
Right.
And beyond that, we have a big question mark because, our own history tells us that after genocides, populations take a long time to even remotely begin to start bouncing back, let alone actually bouncing back. Yeah. And the time difference between A New Hope and The Force Awakens is about 35 years. It's not actually that long of a time period in the grand scheme of things. 35 years ago, it was in our real world, Rwandan genocides coming up in Srebrenica. How much has population changed in those 35 years? And if you then extrapolate that out across kind of a galactic level, then it becomes quite bleak.
Yeah. There's one thing that's troubled me at some level, and I'm not going to be able to put the words on it quite right, but you will be able to understand what I'm trying to say, which is, this whole impression of the Empire and how bad it is and how oppressive it is. I don't want to delude myself. That can come about pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But it's almost instantaneous. It's the Emperor takes over from the Senate. Yes, there's a war going on, but we only see it affecting really in battle scenes, right? We see big battle scenes. We see a huge army, all of that. But we're not seeing how it's affecting what presumably are the 90+% population of the galaxy that's just funding this war. And then all of a sudden, it's an empire. Everyone feels oppressed, and this random guy on a desert planet hates the empire without explanation.
For reasons unestablished.
And the explanation we have at some level is people in the prequels, at least some people, understood democracy and representation, and that was an inherent good. And Lucas's theme quite explicitly was that democracies don't lose because they are taken over by an outside force that's greater than them. They're undermined from within, usually with people going along with it for reasons that, we don't need to be explained.
Yeah.
That seems clear, right? That's his setting up the prequels to get to the point where we have this big bad empire that everyone hates, that there is some residual feeling of, but wait a minute, we used to have a representative democracy of some sort and, protected by space wizards with light swords. But in the 7, 8, and 9, I'm kind of missing that. Like I'm missing the connective tissue of, but we really have that feeling. The spirit that keeps us going is representative democracy across species in this great big galaxy. And instead you just get, well, the heroes want to hang on. And I'm wondering if, as much crap as Lucas gets for the prequels for many reasons, if he actually fundamentally got something right about telling a story and using the symbolism to bring that out in the sequels that could have easily been picked up on even with the existing narrative in the sequels that they just kind of left on the cutting room floor.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a possibility there because, as you say, Lucas's vision of democracy, and particularly if there's as using the prequels as an example, is of they are given away in times of crisis. And he thinks, Caesar, Napoleon, Hitler were his kind of top three examples of that people are willing to trade it away,
right,
for safety and security and the like. And there's an interesting aspect to that because it's a very Western kind of thing to talk about, democracy and freedom as these kind of concepts that are fantastic and wonderful and worth fighting and surviving for. But I've got friends who grew up in like East Germany during the Cold War and they understand these things, but they also have like a very different perception of it. So, you talk a lot about democracy and freedom, but it doesn't flow out of my tap when I turn it on. I can't eat democracy and freedom. Mm-hmm. So these glorious things, I don't fully understand what this thing is if I can't hold it in my hands and I can't exist off of it. Yeah. But in and amongst this, George Lucas, and I say this as somebody living through 2024 and everything that goes on. Yep. George Lucas might have a more cynical view of democracy than anybody else, because he never actually shows us what it's supposed to be good at.
Right.
His view of the Republic is dreadful. It's this, again, a bloated, bureaucratic, administrative monster that doesn't care about people. It's all corrupt and yet somehow is worth holding on to rather than the Empire. And even the expanded universe novels and the old legend stuff, they never showed a vision of democracy that worked either. You know, the New Republic was always 15 minutes away from being overthrown by some neo-imperial goblin before, you know, the holy trinity of Han, Leia and Luke jumped in the Millennium Falcon and went off to save the day. You never actually get a vision that this thing that everybody is fighting and dying for is worth it. That it actually works in any way, shape or form, but apparently it's better than this top-down oppressive system that blows up planets. Because, yeah, that top-down oppressive system that blows up planets sounds dreadful. I don't want that either. But show me the better thing that makes it worth everything that these people are going to go through, rather than just the idea of the better thing.
And building on that, it's not just that we don't see democracy working. Because let's be honest, democracy is messy. Democracy can be slow. Democracy is all the things that an efficient bureaucracy isn't. So I'll give some forgiveness to people who are writing 100%. Stories across the generations that democracy has always got trouble. Okay, I'll allow that. But I will say that we don't actually see when Padme says, you know, this is how liberty dies. The only liberty that we have any glimpse of is people in the Senate at least sometimes being allowed to speak their mind.
Yes.
But that's it. Now, there's the idea that that represents a deeper galactic well of liberty, but we don't see it. And I'm okay with not taking screen time to show on 12 different worlds, different alien species having representative councils that lead to free and fair elections. But we don't see it. And if anything, we see the opposite, which is a world that is supposed to be the representation of liberty paradise is represented by a queen. So what is the democracy and liberty that they were at least idealizing and fighting for?
Yeah. And it ends up, to my mind, being it's the other side of the Empire coin. The Empire is evil because empires are evil. And democracies are great because it's great to be a democracy. And it then exists on a very kind of superficial level that, you know, of course it's better than the other thing. Despite everything, every time you show me an element of it, I don't want it. There's nothing going on in the prequel films in the Republic that makes me think that seems like a well-conceived way of governing the galaxy in the best interests of the people. And you're right, you know, no one's going to spend a chunk of a film showing the inner workings of democracy. But I find it interesting. And again, what you say that, you know, when Palpatine declares the Empire and everybody's applauding and Padme gets her line about liberty dying, it's like, was it alive in The Phantom Menace? When, you know, Palpatine's leaning over and you go, oh, you know, that Chancellor's super corrupt and the bureaucrats are going to get involved in a minute, and then it happens. Is this, you know, you've got mega corporations having the same democratic rights as planets full of people. It's like, is this an alive democracy? Is this an alive liberty? At what point did this even get put on life support? Because there's nothing here that makes me think this is sustainable. And I find it interesting, this kind of idea that has kind of emerged, and you saw it again in the old expanded universe and the legends, and it's appearing now in kind of the new Disney product, that people might overestimate how much input Palpatine is having on pulling the blocks out from underneath this. I don't think he's creating this awful system. I think he's just there to exploit it. And he got, you know, chronologically, he got lucky that his time as the most evil man in the universe happened to be at the moment when the Republic was at its most vulnerable to be pushed off the edge. But it's been eroding for a long time now, and this system hasn't been working for, you know, 100 years or more. So any notion of, you know, liberty dying in Revenge of the Sith, it's like, I don't think the prognosis for the patient was pretty good before that, Padme.
Yeah, definitely. The other aspect that you've explored a bit, and I still find that I don't have a good answer to, is the whole, you know, is there a message from the presence and treatment of droids? because, and I think we're overthinking if we're trying to project back to Lucas. I don't think, unless you see something in his interviews that I don't see something early on where he was trying to make a point about droids and the future of AI and the rights of created creatures in that sense. C-3PO was, fun. He was the laugh track in many ways.
Yeah.
The interactions between him and R2 were Abbott and Costello in metallic form.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to read into it now, like we're doing on everything else, of course, because it's fun. Later on, I think that comes up. And I think Solo does an interesting thing with, the robot and the Millennium Falcon hyperdrive.
And the droids' rights movement.
Right. But overall, I mean, what's your take on, in universe, how much the droid thing is really a thing? Or is it more like the books versus the movies in the Harry Potter universe with the, Hermione wanting to liberate the house elves, and then it just gets dropped in the movies because there's already so much other stuff going on and it was, inconsequential anyway. Where do you stand on that with droid rights being an actual issue in the universe as subtext, or whether we're just reading way too much into it?
So I think it's a mix. I think you're probably right that George Lucas is not necessarily trying to make a far-ranging point about this, to the extent that his base level trying to make a point, and the concept of robots in science fiction movies is an existing theme, and there are bodies of literature about what robots generally mean, from Fritz Lang's Metropolis all the way up to the making of Star Wars. I think a lot of the idea that droids are viewed as being subservient or lesser than sentient creatures, a lot of that gets populated in the books. I mean, we do get in A New Hope the barman being like, we don't serve their kind here, send them outside. And again, I think in 1970s America, there's an element of, you're not the type of people who are allowed in this drinking establishment, will probably have a civil rights resonance in that time period. Mm-hmm. But the droids' rights movement, or kind of the concept of it, is a super interesting one, because there's loads and loads of old Legends expanded universe books about droids getting a pretty bad rap and a pretty bad time and being treated as possessions and objects, and they get traded amongst people and the like. But it never actually then manifests itself as, and also there's a droids' rights movement, until you get a bit of it in a book series in the late 90s, early 2000s, which is called the New Jedi Order book series, where you have this kind of reference to a droids' rights movement plot line alongside this group of kind of evil invading aliens who view technology as being kind of blasphemous. So they're smashing up droids, which then ties into the idea that, droids have feelings, droids have rights. But that plot line gets dropped about halfway through the book series. So a lot of the concept that, of squaring the circle of droids are treated badly and there should be a droids' rights movement is left hugely disconnected. And I think Solo makes a really interesting thing of then actually taking it to its logical conclusion. If you are treating droids like this, then there should be, or there would be, some group of people and groups of droids who go, I'm not down for this. This isn't great, and this isn't right. Yeah, fine, I'm a mechanical being, but am I any weirder than any of the other patrons in this bar? Does this make me lesser so? And I find that interesting in a sense that Star Trek did this.
Yes.
Star Trek did with, episodes like The Measure of a Man, really looked at the concept of android rights in a way that Star Wars hasn't, or hadn't, certainly in that time period, until very, very recently.
And that's not fair to the Star Wars universe at some level, or Star Trek, because they're different. Star Wars, as
and there's so much more of it. With episodes, you've got like a 24 episode season. Eventually, you're going to do something about androids.
Exactly. And just the fundamental concept. Star Wars is fantasy. Star Wars is space opera, whatever you want to call it. Star Trek is science fiction with social commentary. Fiction. Yeah. I want to hit some theories with you, just to get your take on these. Some of these fit the themes we've talked about politics and history and governance, but some don't. One is something that I've been thinking about for a while, and I'm sure somebody infinitely smarter than me has explored this in the expanded universe. But I've always wondered, did the Emperor, who we establish in the prequels, that Senator, then Chancellor Palpatine, orchestrated so many events, playing on what was happening anyway because of declines of democracies, but he set up things in a rather complicated way with separatists and droid armies and all of this. And we find out in Return of the Jedi that this great moment of finding out that there's this new Death Star and the Emperor's even going to be there and we're going to have a chance to get him, that he also set all that up. So clearly he's able to, as a strategist, think ahead and perhaps through Force skills, see some of the future actions. Got it.
Yeah.
So my question is, did the Emperor either set up and assist, or did he just want the very rebellion that we see in the original movies, because it is very useful as a leader trying to consolidate power to have an enemy like a rebel group that you can blame atrocities on. So rather than the impression that we get that the rebels fought against this evil empire and they blew up the Death Star and then they got to this point, that was all part of his plan, that he actually wanted it. And then with 7, 8, and 9, the idea that, did he even foresee the fact that Vader, after all of the torture and everything he did, was going to find a way to get rid of him? And that's why he spent infinite resources setting up a much bigger, much badder base on Exegol. And that, in fact, the entire original 3 movies were part of Palpatine's plan all along.
So there are bits of this that were established in varying forms by either kind of the old expanded universe legends and the like. So there was a series, a couple of computer games that then also had novels and like comics attached to them, The Force Unleashed. And in those games and novels, Darth Vader begins training his own apprentice. Because, the rule of Sith Lords is you can only have 2. You train your apprentice, you off the previous master, and then you're back to 2 again. And as part of that process, Vader kind of working with the Emperor, who's aware that Vader's training this apprentice and isn't particularly pleased about it. And there's a kind of weird tension between that. Use the apprentice to form the Rebel Alliance because it's useful. Again, it's in exactly the same ways as you say, it's useful to have this group of people causing these issues, because then you can look reasonable when you crack down on them. And eventually they become a group that, the Empire loses control of. So there's almost a kind of a Mujahideen American possibility there of, training the paramilitaries who will then eventually in the future cause you more problems. So that aspect definitely exists. And then at the end of those games, again, these were all in expanded universe legend stuff. So it was kind of decanonized when George Lucas sold Disney. They then become aware that they've over-inspired the rebellion in the early stages. Now they actually have a problem that it's going to be, they now actually have to start ripping it out by the roots, or it's going to cause issues further down the line. If we look now instead at the kind of the wider kind of trilogy of, how much is Palpatine foreseeing of his own future? And I think that whilst, Palpatine exists within the framework of the Sith Lords, which is the rule of 2, which is the master embodies the power and the apprentice desires the power. And at some point, the apprentice will gather enough power, kill the master, and they'll become the master. I don't think Palpatine's down with the latter half of that plan. He's never struck me as a guy who is interested in creating an empire for somebody else to have. And you see in the prequels this kind of tantalizing vision of Palpatine that he's dangling over Anakin Skywalker of, the ability to cheat death and the ability to stay alive forever. But clearly that's what Palpatine wants. He's not interested in retiring and some kind of hereditary monarchy or anything like that. He's built his toy and he wants to play with it. I think the critique of Palpatine that Luke Skywalker gives of him when he meets him in Return of the Jedi Palpatine says, your faith in your friends is your weakness, and Luke Skywalker shoots back and says, your overconfidence is yours. Or I think it's actually the other way around. But that, I think, is a critique that holds up. I don't think the Emperor expects. He thinks that Vader is so hobbled and beaten and tortured and humbled and broken that he takes Vader's loyalty for granted. So he's not expecting, he hasn't foreseen Vader picking him up and killing him. But I think he's foreseen a point when his mortal body might not last long enough to reach the point of immortality that he's looking for. So he puts in these contingency plans, which is what this massive base on Exegol is for. Is that, I might not discover the secret to eternal life quickly enough, so we'll build a massive life support machine for either myself or my clone body that will keep me alive in a really pretty not working form, but long enough for me to carry on the research. And if I can't find out the secret to immortality, then I guess that's plan B. I'll end up attached to an arcade grabber arm for a while, and that's better than nothing, I guess. So I think you have in Palpatine a man who can clearly see elements of the future and does operate on this highly convoluted 4D chessboard of figuring out all of these moves, but is also shot through with his own weaknesses and his own arrogance that does blind him to the realities of some of the stuff that's going on around him, and allows him to be caught out of guard by Vader at the end of Return of the Jedi, and leads him to dying before he's ready to, in a manner that he wasn't ready to. And even if you look at the plan that he has for turning Luke Skywalker and Return of the Jedi, it's like, why are you doing this while there's a space battle going on outside? You could have done this on Coruscant. You could have had him brought there. You don't have to be doing all of these things at the same time. But it worked for Anakin Skywalker, so I guess it'll work again. That element where Palpatine rests on his laurels a lot. He becomes overly convinced of his own genius.
Yeah, and that's where I go to in my conspiratorial days, is thinking, there's no reason to do that unless you want the rebels to win, unless you have just discovered the way to manipulate the Force so that your essence can stay alive, and you've already got things set up on Exegol. You want the Republic to come back and try, but you've set the seeds for it to be a disaster. You've set the seeds for the First Order. We've already established in the sequels that he set up Snoke and had him ready to come in and lead and, turn Ben Solo to the dark side. So to me, that's actually evidence of the Palpatine master plan, because otherwise the sequels just bringing back Palpatine when everybody thought he was dead is just kind of an eye roll. But it could play into a bigger story of, yes, he's flawed. Every human being is. And Palpatine's flaws deep down are the narcissism and the selfishness and the, everything is, they're bad.
But he has a plan B.
But he has a plan, right?
Yeah.
And it's a long-term plan. He's playing the long game when everybody thinks we've won the game because we've blown up the Death Star, or even because we've defeated him. He's like, you're still playing on that, silly little two-dimensional chessboard, but I showed you space chess at the beginning. I showed you that we play on multiple boards and you don't even see the other board. That makes it a little more interesting for me, because otherwise the resuscitation of Palpatine was just kind of a disappointment in the main line for me. Yeah.
I also think there's an interesting thing about, people misunderstanding what Palpatine wants. People go, he's a senator. He wants to be Supreme Chancellor. I was like, well, no, I'm pretty sure he wants to be Emperor. And then, he's Emperor now. That's what he wanted. Well, if that's what he wanted, then why isn't he enjoying being the Emperor? Why is he still, and the levels to which we don't actually understand the goals of Palpatine, but all that we get to see are the steps that he's making along the way towards the thing that he actually wants. As an example of this, plan that is effectively beyond our comprehension, because we're not as smart as Palpatine is. We don't play on the level that Palpatine does. All that the rebels can do is, play in the gaps of Palpatine's flaws and the flaws of his empire to undermine it in that sense.
Let me hit you with another theory. Snoke because of the similarities between some of his injuries and some of Anakin's injuries on Mustafar, that the core of Snoke that Palpatine was creating in those tanks on Exegol, the core of him was some kind of a clone or using some DNA of Anakin Skywalker.
Oh, that's a fun one. I've not heard that one before. Yeah, I can see it. I wonder about it because, particularly toward, I mean, Palpatine's interest in Anakin is about his power and the weird circumstances of his creation. So there's there is a genetic element of Anakin that Palpatine is interested in, but whilst Palpatine is a pragmatist in that sense, he's more than happy to put himself in danger. He'll make the best of a bad situation. I don't know if Palpatine views anybody as being an equal to him. Right. And Anakin Skywalker is a disappointment, ultimately, to Palpatine. If you ignore the Vader, the armored version of him, Anakin Skywalker turns to the dark side. This is what Palpatine's been waiting for, and he goes off and he gets himself butchered. So maybe he wasn't all that. After Anakin Skywalker's first 15 minutes. Yeah. Outside of that, he becomes this disappointment to Palpatine. So I wonder whether or not Palpatine would be interested. Therefore, okay, there are aspects of you that I'm interested in, but maybe your weakness is inherent. And fine, I'll use Robo Anakin, but you're not the guy I was going to hang my hat on.
Yeah. Okay. Another theory. In the final movie, when Palpatine is having the final confrontation with Rey, there is the stadium full of either resuscitated or somehow hologrammed former Sith Lords. Right? Yeah. Were they actually there? That is, was their essence somehow also brought back in order to feed this dark side eternal life machine? Or was that simply a projection that Palpatine was using to intimidate Rey?
They are there. It's been established in some of the books and the like now that this is a collection of people who are present and are kind of Sith cultists.
Okay, so they are not former Sith Lords. They are actually
no. I don't think they're they're former Sith Lords. They're living people now. And in the final film, all the stormtroopers in the red armor who appear and kind of running around on spaceships and it's some of the books explain that those are like the children of these Sith cultists who've been bred and indoctrinated for this purpose. And some of the comics when Palpatine, that fill in the gaps between the original trilogy, Palpatine spends time at Exegol and shows Vader Exegol. And there are people working there as cultists and, plugging in the Snoke tubes and vats and the like. So they are a present group of people who are living in there.
Okay. The concept of the Force dyad was introduced, I think, in the final movie. And it had not appeared, I think, in anything else before. But it does raise the issue of what other Force dyads have there been or could there have been with others, whether it's a sibling relationship like a Luke Leia. Yeah. I haven't watched The Acolyte yet, but could there be something going on with the character there?
Yeah, I think there is.
Or is there a backstory that could, help illuminate or at least make more entertaining some previous stories that maybe there was a Force dyad, but with the progress of knowledge and learning about the Force that just like Qui-Gon figured some stuff out after thousands of years of Jedi lore, maybe they are just figuring out the whole Force dyad thing.
Yeah, it's entirely possible that, there are examples in the past that there have been these kind of two people in kind of attunement with the Force. What is an interesting thing that's starting to emerge now, again, partly in relation to kind of things like the Acolyte and kind of filling in the gaps and the like, is that the Sith rule of two, the Master and the Apprentice, might be their attempt to create a dyad. We only need two of us, and if we can find a level of attunement between us, then we can unlock all of this greater power. The problem is you want to stab me in the back and I don't like you. So that kind of undercuts it a little bit, but I find that an interesting thing, that's an underlying thing of what the Sith have been trying to do by just having two of them to create their own Force dyad. I think is intriguing enough that I'd be interested to see if they go further with that.
Another theory, and we could actually resolve this theory because he's still around, but that George Lucas would forgive Adolf Hitler and anybody else who commits genocide and mass murder, because the ultimate theme of the original trilogy was Anakin Skywalker, after doing all the things he did as Darth Vader, which presumably involves the deaths of billions or trillions and torture of many. All he has to do at the end is say, my bad, I'm sorry. And suddenly he can commune with the living force. He becomes a force ghost, and he smiles at the end, and everyone walks off as Lando Calrissian claps and dances. Is forgiveness the highest principle that Lucas leaves us with?
It might be. It very, very well might be. And there are conversations when they're making Return of the Jedi where George Lucas is explaining that Vader's going to come back to the light side and he's going to become Anakin Skywalker again, and then we're going to get his Force ghost. And like the directors are like, I think, what are you talking about? He's done these horrible, horrible things, and now he's going to be kind of redeemed and forgiven for all of these sins. And George Lucas's response is, but isn't that what your entire religion's about? The idea that you can be redeemed and you can kind of re-embrace redemption and forgiveness. But at the same time, George Lucas also makes very clear differences between, when we take in, like, again, the prequel trilogies and the backstories, there is a difference between Anakin and Palpatine, in that, there was good in Anakin and it still existed, where there appears to have never been good in Palpatine. Palpatine very much chose this and is very happy with his choice and has no interest in your stupid human forgiveness and redemption. Who are you to redeem and forgive me? Which then creates a difference between, like, regular Joe and potentially, somebody like Adolf Hitler, who is presumably in this metaphor beyond forgiveness. But there's a really interesting kind of line of this that appears in some of the novels and some of the comics. There's a What If Star Wars comic for Return of the Jedi where Vader survives and comes back to the light side and appears in this white armor to be like, let's go hunt down my master. And I like to imagine everybody else go in the background going, or you could go to jail for all the horrible, horrible things you've done. I don't think putting on different clothes is gonna mollify everyone, Darth. But you also get, like, in, like, conversations of the New Republic, in some of there's a series of novels around X-wing pilots and with, like, awful Imperial leaders. This idea that, what if like Grand Moff Tarkin was to come back and say, I'm very sorry, are we going to forgive him and allow him to defect? Because we've accepted other Imperial defectors. Where are we drawing the line of what you did for the Empire is what you did for the Empire, what you do for us is what counts? And that creates a really interesting kind of structure of no real justice system within the New Republic. There's no apparent version of The Hague or the Nuremberg trials that, if you say you're sorry early enough and you join the Rebel Alliance and you make a good enough contribution, then the horrible things that you did for the Empire can be forgiven because you've clearly shown that you have remorse. So maybe it's a time thing, joining up early on is fine. Joining up 5 minutes after the Death Star explodes at Endor, I think you might be motivated by self-interest. Now, you might not actually have the light and the fire of rebellion burning in your heart. The forgiveness as the ultimate principle is definitely there in Star Wars. But when you start to kind of actually consider it, there are issues with it.
Yeah. Okay. Then this theory is the one that I think works at multiple levels, because I'm not sure people actually believe the theory in many cases. But for people who are not fans of the prequels, it finds a way for them to watch those and enjoy them in a different way.
Yeah.
Give me the best evidence for and against the case that Jar Jar Binks is secretly a Sith.
Okay, so the evidence for is that he is similar to Palpatine, always basically knocking around in the background, manipulating events. He's always present. He's the one who gives Emperor Palpatine emergency powers that leads to the kind of the destruction of the Republic and the Clone Wars and the rise of the Empire. He's there, kind of meeting Anakin Skywalker and helping him get together with Padme Amidala. So there is a view of him kind of being a similarly, if you choose to view him, Machiavellian puppet master. He also has a fighting style that isn't that dissimilar from Emperor Palpatine's. He accidentally in The Phantom Menace, knocks over some battle droids in the big battle at the end, and he kind of flies through the air in various comical ways. But it's in a manner that isn't that dissimilar to how Emperor Palpatine flies through the air when he's carving up Jedi in Revenge of the Sith.
Yeah.
The counterpoint to this is all of the other things about Jar Jar Binks, I think, and the fact that George Lucas hasn't absolutely no consideration of Jar Jar Binks as a Sith Lord. He's purely in there for reassuring comic relief for an audience of children, effectively. His viewpoint is, some of the stuff in The Phantom Menace with Darth Maul and can be pretty scary, but that nothing bad can happen because Jar Jar Binks is there to keep you company. He's a reassuring kind of child protector in that things, and then he becomes less important as the films, the prequels go on, partly because of some of the backlash against the character in The Phantom Menace. But it's a funny thing, and there's a Lego Star Wars game that's about to come out, which is like a what if thing where the Star Wars universe gets messed up somehow and everything gets twisted, and in that game Jar Jar Binks is a Sith Lord. What
a great nod to that that section of the fan base that wants that to be true. Now they can say there is some justification for it.
Yeah.
Well, it is our tradition at the end of an interview to reach into our chatterbox and find a random question for you.
The magic box.
Chris.
If it's like the Ark of the Covenant and my face is about to melt off,
it's not like the Ark of the Covenant. It is the Ark of the Covenant.
Oh, fantastic. Right. I'll go and put some sunglasses on.
Yeah, but somehow we've overcome the spells on it to make sure that our faces don't melt and we just get enlightened and entertained. Chris, name one dead political or national security related leader from any era that we could really use right now.
Oh,
don't say Jar Jar Binks or else this interview is over.
Yeah. Maybe FDR. I mean, the problem with trying to kind of draw on people from the past is, the past is pretty bleak and people did some pretty bleak things in the past within the time periods of them. And there's a difference between judging somebody for the stuff that they did in the past from the present and also going there are people in that time period who are judging you for what you were doing.
Right.
Right. But, I don't need to talk about anybody outside of your time period to cast judgment on some of the stuff that you were up to. Yeah. But for all of his kind of reluctance to initially get involved, when it became apparent that, the Second World War was going to be a thing and, once the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, FDR doesn't do it by half measures. No. He turns every element of the American state into powering a war effort on multiple continents to supplying. He's already been supplying Britain and Soviet Union with arms for a prolonged period of time, and then throws, a lot of equipment and the like into that aspect. So, if we were to draw, conclusions with, Ukraine at the moment, similarly, or just like somebody who is going to commit everything to dealing with rising fascism, then maybe it is an FDR type figure, just slightly modernized.
I can't argue against that answer. Chris, I want to thank you for the extended time and conversation. I will point people to the books that explore some of the things we've talked about, Star Wars and otherwise. You've written academic works like The First World War in Computer Games.
Yes.
The British, French, and American Relations on the Western Front. And then most recently in the Star Wars universe, you have the new book, The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire in Universe. And then the more academic study for those of us who are interested in the analysis side of things, which is the history and politics of Star Wars. Chris Kempshall, thank you. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. It's been a really fun 2-hour chat about Star Wars and history. I should do this every week.
Thank you. That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at ThatWasChatter.